Get into it here. Current conditions downtown Mobile, 57 degrees. So temperatures have actually cooled off the last couple of hours. We've had these winds that are starting to pick up, so it's a little bit breezy. We've had the front pass through. The rain is done, and now we're seeing the cooler, drier air moving on in. There's the line of storms now working its way over towards Tallahassee. So we are now out of that. No more severe weather possibilities for us, at least today. There will be some down the line. I'll talk about that in a moment. But otherwise, we might get a couple little sprinkles here and there this morning in the Panhandle. But beyond that, we are done. The front is pushing on through. Behind the front, cooler, drier air. And you're going to feel that when you step outside. We're also going to get some breezes out there today. Look at our wind gusts today, up around 30 miles per hour through most of the day. So it's going to be pretty breezy at times here for your Thursday. Temperature-wise, we'll be up into the 60s. Right now, we've come back down in the 50s. We'll be in the 60s, though, by this afternoon. Should see some sunshine out there for you today. And then as we look at the highs, just kind of around the area, everybody generally going to be in the 60s, maybe a couple of upper 50s possible in some of our inland areas. The rest of the area should be in the 60s here for today. This evening, get off work, maybe have some things to run around and do. Looks pretty good here as well in the 50s and still a little bit breezy, so keep that in mind. It'll probably feel a little cool, especially if you got kids out at practice or something. You got to go sit out there. Here's the outlook. This is going to be, I know it looks very similar, almost exactly the same as this last one, but this is actually the next one. Saturday night, Sunday morning. When I say Saturday night, I mean more like overnight, not so much in the early part of the evening, but overnight. Going into Sunday morning, level 2 for most of our areas. There's a small sliver level 3, a small sliver level 1, but most of our area for the moment is in a level 2 risk zone for overnight Saturday into Sunday morning. Here's 6 o'clock on Saturday. We got evening parades on Saturday night. Our Fox 10 float will be there. I'm supposed to be on that float. Probably depend on exactly where these storms are. And then we'll see this rain eventually move in, like mostly overnight is what the models have been saying. Now, it's still a few days out. Timing of this can change by a few hours, and that wouldn't be too drastic, so something to keep in mind. It could come in a little bit earlier on Saturday. It could come in a little later on Sunday. But just be aware that we're looking at another risk zone here. Damaging winds and a few tornadoes are going to be a possibility with this system as it pushes through on Sunday. Then behind it, it'll clear out and it'll cool off. This will be a more significant cold front than the one we're experiencing today. Today's fun, it's good. I mean, it's going to be the 60s today, 40s tomorrow morning, 60s in the afternoon again tomorrow and your Friday. Looks great for Valentine's Day. Looks great for that first parade of the season there. Mobile season, I should say, with the Condi Cavaliers. Temperatures there will be in the low 60s. I would still grab a light jacket because, in downtown Mobile, breeze between the buildings, it'll probably feel a little cool. Make sure you have a jacket with you just in case. And then as we go into the weekend, of course, then we're going to be watching out for some stronger storms Sunday morning. And then next week, look at that cold air coming in. Monday morning down to around freezing. So there it is, some chillier air finally on the way. It's been a while. We've been way above average here for all of February so far, but we're finally going to get a chance to cool off as we head towards the last third of the month.
Or outright lie we've heard from the Republican distractors of USAID. These are distractions meant to obscure the critical work USAID does. I instead submit into the record the stories by the Washington Post, the New York Times, fact-checking and dubious claims made by the Republicans.
Do you have them?
Yes.
So ordered.
And what I will use my time on is making clear that this hearing title, the USAID betrayal, is absolutely correct. Because this is a betrayal. The Trump administration is betraying our national security. It is betraying our allies. It is betraying the Americans who carry out USAID's mission in some of the world's most challenging and dangerous places. It is betraying the generosity of the American people, and it is betraying the investments Americans have made for decades to stop diseases before they spread, to make sure girls have the same educational opportunities as boys, and to make sure that the innocent victims ravaged by war or natural disaster have basic human necessities. It's betraying babies who have been born with HIV in the last 3 weeks who could have been born HIV-free if only we continued to provide their mothers with the necessary medication they were sitting on the shelves. It's betrayed America's victory in nearly wiping out polio around the world by stopping the funding to stamp it out in the last 2 countries on earth with the virus still present. Want to know what happens when we stop funding this type of work? Just look at Kansas, where the outbreak of tuberculosis right now grows. So it's not just about health programs. Economic development programs in Latin America build stronger communities and help reduce migration to the United States. Good governance, independent media, civil society programs in developing countries help break debt traps from China and ensure citizens can enjoy their God-given rights. Bottom line, who wins when we pull back from one of America's greatest strengths? China wins. Russia wins. Our adversaries win. So yes, this is a betrayal. This is a betrayal of our national security. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I think I called it exactly right what the arguments were going to be. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have our panel of witnesses here today on this important topic. Max Primorak, Senior Research Fellow at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. The Honorable Ted Yoho, former U.S. Representative from Florida's 3rd Congressional District, and the Honorable Andrew Natsios, former Administrator at the U.S. Agency for International Development. This committee recognizes the importance of the issues before us and is grateful to have you here to speak with us today. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your comments, spoken remarks to less than 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. Hopefully you give us something that more than what we could just read in your opening statements. And I would also ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize Mr. Primorak for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify before this committee. My name is Max Primorak. I am a Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. I previously served at the U.S. Agency for International...
PEPFAR saves lives! Restore AIDS funding now! PEPFAR saves lives! Restore AIDS funding now! PEPFAR saves lives! Restore AIDS funding now!
PEPFAR saves lives! Restore AIDS funding now! PEPFAR saves lives! Restore AIDS funding now! PEPFAR saves lives! Restore AIDS funding now! PEPFAR saves lives! Restore AIDS funding now! PEPFAR saves lives! Restore AIDS funding now! PEPFAR saves lives! Restore AIDS funding now!
I guess these guys don't watch the news. They didn't realize that PEPFAR was one of the many programs that did prove to be life-saving, so the funding was restored. Somebody better give them a link to, I don't know, maybe Fox News or something like that. You may resume your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I previously served at the U.S. Agency for International Development and the U.S. Department of State. I've dedicated 35 years to international relations work. The views I express here today are my own. President Donald Trump's decision to shutter USAID reflects the agency's loss of bipartisan support in Congress and the trust of the American people. It exposes a bureaucracy that went off the ideological rails and no longer reflects the will or the values of the American people. What should be and must be an effective tool of U.S. foreign policy has turned into a partisan global vehicle focused on spending money rather than achieving concrete outcomes aligned with American interests and on imposing radical social ideas that divide us at home and spur resentment abroad. They refuse to be held accountable to Congress and American taxpayers who fund them. Advocates evoke dangers to our national security, citing programs to counter communist China, protect us from the global spread of infectious diseases, and provide life-saving humanitarian aid. I understand the importance of these programs. At USAID, I co-chaired a counter-China interagency group, oversaw containment of 2 Ebola outbreaks, and led the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. But USAID's obsession with identity politics, gender fluidity, population control, and climate fanaticism undermined these goals. Americans are now aware of massive waste, fraud, and abuse of their money. Every single project was corrupted by this radical agenda. They are not happy. USAID's leadership failed in its most basic fiduciary responsibility, and that is to avoid the kinds of reputational risks that would imperil the agency's legitimacy with Congress and the American people. USAID pushed developing countries to rely on communist China for their green energy needs. 2 years ago, 131 African lawmakers and religious leaders from 13 countries implored Congress not to use PEPFAR to promote abortion, stating, "We want to express our concerns and suspicions that this funding is supporting abortion, that it violates our core beliefs concerning life, family, and religion." Many Africans have told me, but also from other places in the world, the Chinese do not ask us to give up our religion to do business with them. Mr. Chairman, our aid approach has severely harmed our global standing. USAID's humanitarian system is also broken. In Gaza, American aid financed Hamas's campaign to exterminate Israel. Similarly, in Afghanistan, Yemen, and Syria, where we lack physical presence to ensure that our aid is not diverted to terrorists, our aid is sustaining these war economies. USAID failed to properly manage the billions of dollars entrusted to it. This committee discovered that USAID partners were charging 50% or more for overhead. A government audit showed that USAID could not account for overhead charges concerning $142 billion worth of awards. These funds proved a boon for the progressive-dominated foreign aid industry. President Trump's leadership has created a unique opportunity to fast-track important reforms of our aid system. Secretary Rubio might look at the reforms made during the last Trump administration. Our starting point was that the purpose of foreign aid is to end the need for it. Foreign aid is not an international welfare program. USAID is not an international NGO. These must align with American interests and values. A final point. Congress must also do its part. Why should pro-Hamas South Africa, Beijing's point country in Africa, receive billions of dollars of aid from us? We should support our friends instead. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Primorak. I now recognize Mr. Yoho for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Meeks, and members of the committee, it's an honor to participate in this hearing regarding USAID. I'm a former member of Congress serving from 2013 to 2021, representing Florida's 3rd Congressional District. During my 8 years in Congress, I served on this and the Agricultural Committee. I had the honor to serve as chairman of the Asia Pacific Subcommittee during the 115th Congress. I entered Congress.
Mr. Yoho, could you move a little closer to your mic?
It'll help turn it on too, won't it?
Thank you.
I lost that knowledge already, huh? I entered Congress with the goal of eliminating foreign aid for various reasons. Looking back, I was ignorant on what I thought foreign aid was, what it did, and thought it was unnecessary. Soon after my first foreign congressional delegation trip, I realized that foreign aid, when used properly, can be a tool in soft diplomacy that strengthens the nation's economy, security, increases trade, decreases migration, creates strong partners and allies. When used improperly, it has the opposite effect on both our friends and adversaries and wastes taxpayers' money. I became a strong proponent of reforming international assistance by working in a bipartisan and bicameral fashion with my co-sponsors, along with the first Trump administration when we introduced the BUILD Act that authorized the creation of the DFC. This was the largest reform in foreign aid in over 2 decades, and my goal was to move countries from aid to trade with the use of effective tools managed correctly. I chaired, along with Congressman Adam Smith, the Effective Aid Caucus and met with members and outside groups to improve efficiency and effectiveness on assistance. This committee has had many hearings dealing with USAID. It's frustrating that an agency set up to further our security, prosperity, engage in humanitarian projects, and work to prevent the spread of diseases, hunger, and conflict have strayed so far from its original intent when it was created under President Kennedy in 1961. USAID has lost the trust of a large portion of the American people and the international community. Remember, President Lincoln, he said, with public support, you can do almost anything. Without it, you can't do anything. The redesigned U.S. Foreign Assistance entity will have to work hard to recreate that trust here and abroad. Many new reforms are necessary in USAID. There are many ways reform can be performed. And many administrations, and as I heard here today, Congresses have acknowledged this. Yet we did not act. The Trump administration acted, and there's a lot of angst and concerns about who has authority, how's it going to be done. Those debates will go on as long as people want to debate, criticize, and complain. President Trump and Secretary Rubio stated the objectives of international aid very clearly moving forward. Does it make America safer, stronger, and more prosperous? It'll serve the nation, our security, and economy, as well as developing nations and our allies to get new reforms in place as soon as possible. Not all aid is bad, nor is it all good. We should focus on those programs that are good and make them better and more effective. Programs that were misused and not aligned with the administration should be eliminated. Congress should look to support programs that have a proven track record of success, and there are many examples to look at, and I'll be happy to discuss those. Moving forward, I would recommend the Trump administration place aid into two categories. First, the hard infrastructure projects like road, water, energy, transportation. These are the projects that are necessary to build an economy in the recipient country so we can wean them off of aid. The U.S. government has instruments like the DFC, MCC, tasked with the heavy lifting in initial phases of a project by providing risk insurance, technical assistance, and expertise, and brings in outside investors and other nations' DFIs. Second, the humanitarian side of assistance via a repurposed USAID type entity working synergistically with the DFC and other USG agencies. Feed the Future, African Growth, and Opportunity Act are effective health and food security programs when implemented properly and generate much soft power goodwill. Unfortunately, if mismanaged, we lose credibility, money, and drive the affected nations to our adversaries. By pausing U.S. international assistance, a vacuum is created. China, Russia, or other are already moving in to fill those voids. The U.S. must quickly bring back the authorization, funding, and a knowledgeable workforce to implement those programs that align with the administration's goal. Does it make America safer, stronger, and more prosperous? One last point. By not being effectively present can be arguably worse than pausing a program. And all you have to do is look at South and Central America and look at how much we've ceded to China and their influence from Russia, China, and Iran. That has to be dealt with immediately. That's a national security threat. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I yield back my time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. I now recognize Mr. Natsios for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. I speak for myself today. I've been involved in humanitarian work, development work.
Let's try that microphone one more time. Maybe pull it a little closer.
Okay, how's that?
Much better.
Better, okay. I speak for myself today. I don't represent anyone. And I've been doing this work since 1989 when I joined the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, as the director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance when the world order was collapsing. And our little office, along with the Food for Peace office, saved tens of millions of lives around the world, which they continued to do through the BHA Bureau, which is now much larger than it was when I was there. If you're upset about getting off course, so am I. But let's course correct, not course destroy. When I took over AID as the administrator in Bush 43, W's administration, in early 2001, I ordered my deputy to begin reviewing every single project, every single program in AID, line by line, and we eliminated 80 programs over a month. And we moved that cash back into the program because there was a cassava mosaic that was destroying the cassava crop in Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Eastern Congo. There was a risk of a famine. And we got cuttings in, and we stopped the pandemic, the disease pandemic for the cassava. My point is, I eliminated a lot of philosophically offensive programs that a conservative administration would not tolerate. And when the Democrats took over, they moved the agency to the left. I moved it to the right. The Obama people actually said I was very right-wing. I was the most right-wing administrator in the history of the agency, and yet the career people followed what I wanted to do in the agency. We put heavy emphasis on economic growth. Some of the things you've criticized, sir, with all due respect, are economic growth programs that have been highly successful. 10% of the workforce in Egypt is from tourism. AID has properly invested $100 million over the years, and it's massively increased the number of jobs in Egypt. They are our ally. Don't we want people working instead of being unemployed? It is 12% of the GDP of Egypt, tourism. We call it development tourism. We do it in Lebanon. We do it in Tunisia. We've done it in Kosovo and in Bosnia. We've done it in Morocco. We do it all over the world. It brings in revenue and employs people. It's an economic growth project. I believe in economic growth. I believe in the private sector. I believe in free markets. That's what AID does. The notion that AID is some kind of a Marxist institution is absolutely ridiculous, okay? I know the career officers. I work with them. There is a career track called the private sector officers. And what do? They work with the business community. I started a program which the Democrats continued called the Global Development Alliance. We started it very early on, 2001. What it does is it matches AID money with corporate money to supply their supply chains. We do this all over the world. We're working with hundreds of American corporations. We've raised $60 billion in private sector funding with the American business community to increase jobs all over the world. We've been doing this for 24 years, very successfully. The Europeans and the Canadians and the Australians have taken our lead in this and tried to replicate these public-private alliances. 25% of the money in those GDAs is U.S. government money. 75% is private money. We invest together. We don't give them any money. They don't give us any money. We design the project. We co-invest, and then we manage it. The notion that AID is irresponsible in terms of its oversight is utter nonsense. I wrote an essay 12 years ago called The Clash of the Counter-Bureaucracy and Development. It was published. It's the most cited thing I've written in the scholarly literature. And it was based on my frustration with the level over and over and over again of oversight. The Inspector General, the Special Inspector General. Why do we need two Inspector Generals in Afghanistan and in Iraq? Then we have the GAO, we have the OMB, we have the Congressional Oversight Committee. Every line of what AID does is overseen by 7 different levels of oversight. You know why money disappears? I'll tell you why. Where do we work? Where do we work? Christian NGOs are now delivering food in Sudan in a famine. There will be 2 million people dead by the end of this year. Those are the projections. There is no government in Sudan. There's no police in Sudan. There are no courts.
I thank you for your opening remarks this morning. And I now recognize Chairman Emeritus, Ranking Member Meeks, for his 5 minutes of questioning. Chairman Emeritus McCall for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I was chairman of this committee, I got congressional notifications of spending programs from USAID and State Department, and I put holds on those programs, many listed by the chairman. Instead of working with me, the administration, the prior Biden administration, decided to blow through those holds, bucking a long-standing tradition. And I want to go through some of those I put on hold. $1.5 million to promote LGBTQ causes for immigrants in Latin America, allowing them to litigate against foreign governments, primarily Catholic nations. I don't know how that advances the U.S. interests abroad. And as a Catholic myself, I find that very offensive. We've also heard about the $15 million for condoms and contraceptives to Afghanistan, a country under Sharia law, $15 million. What did USAID do? They blew through my holds in complete and utter disregard of this committee's oversight responsibilities. I also uncovered the department had spent $500,000 to advance atheism in Nepal. Atheism. in a country where Tibetan Buddhists is a predominant religion. What does that have to do with advancing U.S. interest abroad? The Humanist International Group that they gave money to, the $500,000, the CEO called the Catholic Church an institution you should be ashamed to be involved with. Our taxpayer dollars to condemn the Catholic Church. Again, as a Catholic, I find that extremely offensive. And then the one we've heard so much about, $20,000 for drag shows and drag workshops in Ecuador. Mr. Chairman, I've seen the video you sent out. It is utterly disgusting to the American taxpayer that we are funding that kind of behavior. All these programs gave USAID a black eye. And that's unfortunate. Because you go back to the Marshall Plan, really the genesis for thinking about USAID. The Marshall Plan was one of the most successful programs we endeavored in after World War II to make sure a Hitler never rose from the ashes again. The Food for Peace program, sir, that you discussed, the American farmer benefits from this. It's been extremely successful. Why was USAID created in the first place in 1961? It was to counter the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I believe it still has a legitimate purpose to counter the rising threat of China and Belt and Road and our other foreign adversaries. It also has the ability to counter terrorism. Lindsey Graham and I passed the Global Fragility Act, state, DOD, USAID, all working together to stabilize, destabilize nations, which breed terrorism. PEPFAR, one of the most successful global health programs ever developed under President Bush. Yet all of this is called into question because of the irresponsibility of the Biden administration's woke agenda and policies. Mr. Yo, we've been friends. We work together, colleagues. Your greatest legacy is the BUILD Act, and we need to reinforce that policy as well. But when you look at the core mission, all these programs need to go, and they will be gone. But as we look at program by program and strip down to the core mission, do you still believe that this is a worthwhile endeavor, the core mission of USAID?
I do. I think what you see over a period of time is a mission creep. You know, these programs were designed with purity of purpose. This is what they're supposed to do. And when you get mission creep, you get these things that we're seeing, and they're indefensible, some of the programs that you guys mentioned. And that loses trust, like you said. And in business, what I've learned, and I think everybody can agree with this, people like to do business with people they know, they like, and they trust. If that's true with us on a business setting, it's the same in nations. If other nations know us, they like us, and they trust us, they're going to do business with us. And we've heard this over and over again. You know, it's been brought up by other leaders that...
And can I just ask my time,
Sure.
Is it in our national security interest to maintain the core mission, and I would argue under the State Department for proper supervision?
Yes, it is. And if we don't do that, we cede that leadership to other people.
I now recognize Ranking Member Meeks for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I, too, am a chairman emeritus of this committee, and I can recall where President Trump, when he was the president, blew past some of my things that I wanted to hold. In fact, he's blown past some already in this term. So that's just the will of what presidents do at times in that regards. But in this instance, 93 missions, every one has been closed. Every one. That's not trying to fix something. That's destroying something. But let me just stop there, because one of the reasons why I asked Mr. Natsios to testify here, because he is a lifelong Republican, and He understands the insides and the outsides of running USAID. More so than anybody, no disrespect to anybody that's on this panel. He's the one that has done it. And I will admit, we don't agree on certain things. Democrats and Republicans don't agree. Some things that Republicans do that I believe is full of waste, destructive, but if they win the elections, they have a choice to try to move it in that direction. When Democrats win, what we stand for, we move in our direction. That's part of having a free democratic society. We're not Russia. So I want to put the politics aside for this discussion and ask Mr. Natsios, can you explain to the committee why you believe foreign assistance and the work of USAID, as you've done so, is so essential, and you feel so passionately enough about it that you did respond? Because I've seen administrators, Democrats and Republicans alike, who have worked at USAID alike, come out against closing USAID. Can you tell us that today?
Well, let me tell you two stories. One story is my last month at AID. No one knew except my wife I was going to leave and teach at Georgetown. And this was December of 2005. And I always would get a briefing from the director of counterterrorism at the CIA. And he came in to see me and he said, Mr. Natsios, the chatter is you're coming and they're going to attempt to assassinate you. I said, who? He said, well, obviously the Taliban. I said, why are they going to assassinate me? Because you're the head of AID. They can't deal with AID. They can deal with the military. They just shoot each other. But they can't build health clinics. We built 400 health clinics. We got the child mortality rates and the maternal mortality rates down by a third. It took 7 years to do that, but we did it very successfully. And we opened schools. We published 90 million textbooks in the schools to get the kids back in school. And the Taliban can't deal with that. They're going to try, and we advise you not to go. I said, well, let me think about that. But if you do go, announce you've arrived as you're stepping on the plane to leave. I said, what? He said, announce when you're stepping on the plane to leave, announce you've arrived. So in other words, they won't know you're there. So I went, I decided to go, and nothing happened, and I did what he suggested. But what I found out was, from talking to the mullahs in the village, the religious leaders who were pro-democracy and pro-America, that the Taliban disregarded the greatest enemy of the Taliban was USAID. You know, in Kosovo, they named their kids USAID. They actually, the Albanians are Muslims in Kosovo, and that's Muslim. They made it into a Muslim name, USAID. If you go to the refugee camps and displaced camps around the world, USAID is the image of the United States. We used to bring 20,000 students to the United States to get their advanced degrees during the Cold War. You know what the Chinese, you know what we're doing now? 900 scholarships. We stopped doing it. The Chinese are spending huge amounts of money to bring 40,000 people from the developing world to get their degrees in China. We should be investing in that. We're not. And I think we're falling behind, and we're focused on the wrong things. The amount of DEI stuff. I started going through the RFAs. It's a small percentage. It is not accurate to say that this is, and some of these things that have been shown, those are not AID projects. Those are State Department programs. Why are you blaming AID for what the State Department did? The F office in state controls all this stuff. Now let me tell you a second story. After the Aceh tsunami, we did a huge response. Aceh is a part of Indonesia which had a Muslim insurgency for many years against the central government. We did a huge response. We put the aid logo on everything. The mission director got carried away, 50,000 stickers, USAID from the American people. Before the Aceh tsunami, bin Laden had a 57% approval rating in Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world and a democracy. After it, he collapsed from 57% to 27%. We had a 26% approval rating. We went from 26% to 63%. Now you say, Americans like to be liked. We all like to be liked. But what difference does it make? President Uduono, the president of the country, said, I like President Bush, I like the United States, but it's very hard to work with you because you're so unpopular. Not after the Aceh tsunami. The newspapers in Indonesia said, where is bin Laden when we need him? The Americans here we really don't like, and now we realize who our real friends are.
Thank you for answering our questions today, sir. We appreciate it. We agree. A lot of waste, like $10 million through USAID. Everything I listed was USAID. $10 million for circumcision in Mozambique. There's another example for you. I now recognize Mr. Smith from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Upon assuming office, President Biden repealed President Ronald Reagan's Mexico City policy, expanded by President Donald Trump in 2017. But the Biden administration didn't stop there. They initiated a new, radical vision that integrated aggressive abortion on demand into PEPFAR programming, called it Reimagining PEPFAR, that included explicit guidance directing recipients, and this is billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer funds, to use their leverage to enact pro-abortion laws and policies in PEPFAR countries. Biden hijacked PEPFAR. And he shattered, I did the reauthorization of PEPFAR for 5 years during the Trump administration, the first one. I'm all for it. In this place here and on the floor of the House and all over Africa as I traveled, all for it. But then it was hijacked. In a strong rebuke, and Mr. Max had mentioned this earlier, 131 African lawmakers and religious leaders said that the PEPFAR funding is supporting abortion, and they admonished us to say the NGOs that we finance are hijacking their ideals by pushing it so aggressively in Africa. Mr. Natsios, you testified today, and I read your written statement, that USAID needs to be refashioned, and you said that, quote, you believe it is bad policy to transfer domestic culture wars into politics to the developing world. Do you believe that the Biden administration was wrong to integrate abortion on demand as into global health, because they did it across the board, USAID, and of course PEPFAR, much of that money is deployed through USAID. When you did say that efforts to protect the weakest and most vulnerable from extermination, I do believe that's trivialized when you somehow bottom line it and say it's a culture war. We believe in defending unborn children and their mothers from the violence of abortion. It's not a culture war. It is a fact when they're in these countries pushing it, that unfortunately children will die. I and like-minded pro-life advocates in Congress and around the world seek to protect unborn baby girls and boys from violence of abortion, including dismemberment, decapitation, and of course the abortion pills, which are now being pushed all over the world, including the United States. How do they work? They starve the baby to death. That's how it works. So, I'm all for global. We did two bipartisan. I was the prime sponsor of it. Global Food Security Acts. I'm all for mitigating global hunger. But when you turn around and say to an entire segment of humanity, unborn children, we're going to starve you to death through these abortion pills, to me, that's unconscionable. So do you agree that pro-abortion NGOs should continue to be empowered and subsidized with billions of dollars each year by the American taxpayer to promote abortion with the goal of changing pro-life laws in these nations? And I would ask all three of our witnesses.
Congressman, you can check my voting record in Massachusetts. I 100%, and in Massachusetts, this is in Massachusetts, I had 100% pro-life voting record for 12 years in the House.
Right.
So my position is very clear, and I took a lot of heat from the feminist groups in Massachusetts, and my views have not changed. I called you once because we found them doing vaginal scraping in Bangladesh in a remote village, and the mission director called me immediately. He said, we discovered this, we put a stop to it, Andrew, because if you do that and the woman is pregnant, the child dies, okay? And you're supposed to check before you do it. They weren't trained properly. They weren't doing it maliciously. They just didn't understand because they weren't trained properly. We fixed it very quietly. I called you up and told you what happened. We were being transparent about it. Other than that, that's the only violation we had in the 5 years that I was aid administrator. The career people will do what they're told to do. I am appalled at what you're telling me that they have done. And by dragging AID into these culture wars, the Biden administration has undermined the need for bipartisan support for AID. We cannot tolerate in an agency with programs all over the world, a war between parties, which I'm seeing right now. In my view, it's a failure. All of the things I did at AID, I tried to do it in a way that would not alienate the Democratic Party when I left. If you look before they took apart the agency, everything I created is still there, was still there. They left it in place.
Thank you. I'm almost out of time. The other two distinguished witnesses. Thank you.
Congressman, everything that we did during the first Trump administration, and I had these senior positions, we worked very hard to make sure that everything that we did had bipartisan support. What I've seen with the last administration is actually breaking the law, because you're not supposed to. By law, you're not supposed to. And I think the PEPFAR coordinator has stressed that point. But when you fund International Planned Parenthood, when you fund UN agencies that openly promote it, and when the Africans themselves tell you it's happening, then the law is being broken. I hope that the second Trump administration pursues the pro-life policies that it had in the first one, but also to include humanitarian assistance. Thank you.
When we set these policies forward, it's going to behoove all of us, and this is hard to do. These policies should be what's best for America. If it's best for America, it's going to be best for the rest of the world. And those policies are based on our beliefs as a nation. If we're a Christian nation, as we always talk about, that's the right thing to do. And I think we need to stay that way. And the hard part is, with us in this body, we have to keep the checks on that. If not, it goes away. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I'm glad to hear the conversation about university spending as well, because there's a lot of that within USAID also. $42 million for Johns Hopkins to research and drive social behavior, and $250,000 for FIU for DEI training, and $244,000 for Stanford to do leadership training, not life-saving programs. I now recognize Mr. Sherman from California.
Foreign aid is a good thing. Americans think that we spend 25% of the federal budget on foreign aid and want it reduced to 10%. But the fact is, it's way less than 1%. It helps us challenge China in the world. It reduces not only hunger, but migration to our borders. And it helps us fight communicable diseases over there before they mutate and come here, and that's why Ronald Reagan recognized the importance of foreign aid. Mr. Chairman, my fear, because I've been here for a long time, when I got here, it wasn't just Democrats against Republicans, it was the legislative branch against the executive branch. And we need to play that role, and as the ranking member points out, we need to have government witnesses here so we can talk about the future rather than just be a cheering squad for the executive branch. But I want to bring to your attention, Mr. Chairman, an action taken by the State Department today that was too woke for Sherman. They announced that they're going to spend $400 million on zero greenhouse gas emitting armored cars. That's right, electric armored cars. $400 million to replace perfectly good gas-driven armored cars. They said they were going to be Tesla Cybertruck armored cars. This administration will get too woke for Sherman if it helps the shareholders of the Tesla automobile. There have been a number of falsehoods stated. The biggest one is the $50 million for Gaza condoms. Musk admitted that it was just completely false. He apologized. So that Doge made a mistake. Are we going to terminate Doge? Well, I'd like to, but we're going to terminate Doge because it made one mistake? No. You identify mistakes that are a lot less than $50 million, people want to terminate USAID. Musk statement he should be apologizing for and publicizing, because the truth has a tough time catching up with the falsehood. But let's go through a few others. We're told that there's $6 million to fund tourism in Egypt. Mr. Natsios, you would demonstrate how that's a good program. We should give credit to Donald Trump for that program. He started it under his first administration. Now it's being attacked. We're told that circumcision is terrible. It's a very cheap operation. It's only done voluntarily. It's been done by Democratic and Republican administrations, including Trump. Why? Because it's a 60% reduction in the risk of female-to-male transmission of HIV. We were told that USAID was spending $80 million on subscriptions to Politico. No, the entire executive branch was doing that. But you know who else spends money on Politico? Republicans in Congress who spend $800,000 of their office budget on Politico. And Mr. Chairman, you didn't spend any money on Politico. Like me, you spent your money on on Bloomberg, as do I. Of course, Michael Waltz spent his money, over $8,000 on Politico just for his own office.
Mr. President.
The Democratic leader.
Mr. President, this morning, the Senate will vote on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy to serve as Secretary of Health and Human Services. By now, it's beyond clear that Mr. Kennedy is not remotely qualified to become the next Secretary of HHS. In fact, Mr. Kennedy might be one of the least qualified people that Donald Trump could have chosen for the job. There are so many others who would have been better. I'm very proud that every single Democrat will oppose Mr. Kennedy's nomination, because Democrats know better than to elevate a conspiracy theorist to the top health care job in the country. I know some of my colleagues feel the same way privately. In fact, if the Senate held a secret ballot today, I'll bet Mr. Kennedy would never come close, and that many, if not most, Republicans would vote against him. I think most likely most Republicans would vote against him if there were a secret ballot. But sadly and unfortunately for America, Republicans are being strong-armed by Donald Trump and will end up holding their nose and voting to confirm Mr. Kennedy. What a shame. What a travesty. I urge my Republican colleagues to think very carefully one last time before rolling the dice on Mr. Kennedy. A vote to confirm Mr. Kennedy is a vote to make America sicker. Mr. Kennedy has made a living not by promoting public health, but by actively fighting it. Mr. Kennedy is the face of the modern anti-vaccine movement. Mr. Kennedy has spent decades profiting off vaccine misinformation. Mr. Kennedy told me to my face that he would, quote, defer to the president on issues as personal, as deeply held, as important as abortion. Well, how do we know that Mr. Kennedy won't just defer? I'm an expert on health care, on other issues and health care issues as well. It's simple. We don't. But if he can change his view and defer to the president on something as deeply held as abortion, the likelihood is he'll change his view on many other health care issues to the detriment of the American people. One thing he won't change his views on is vaccines, I am sure, because he's held that so deeply. My Republican colleagues should think very carefully before voting to elevate a vaccine skeptic, a conspiracy theorist, to oversee our health care system. If confirmed, I fear greatly that Mr. Kennedy will take steps that severely undermine public health, weaken safety standards, and put the needs of for-profit corporations ahead of the needs of American families. And sooner or later, public backlash is going to build, and Republicans will have wished they hadn't signed their names for such a troubled nominee. So one final time, I implore my Republican colleagues to reject the nomination of Kennedy to be Secretary of HHS. A vote to confirm Mr. Kennedy is a vote I truly believe many, many Republicans and most Americans will eventually very deeply regret. Now on costs, lowering costs for average families in the budget resolution. Well, my colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Americans, welcome to the age of Trumpflation. Trumpflation. If there was one mandate that Donald Trump had after winning the election, it was to fight inflation. Remember what he said on the campaign trail? He said, quote, "When I win, I will immediately bring prices down starting on day one." Starting on day one, he said he will bring prices down. Well, today is day 25, and inflation is not down, but actually up by 3%, higher than what economists were expecting. At the grocery store, the price of pork and chicken and beef are all up. Eggs are up 15% from last month. Gas prices are up 2% from last month. Used cars are up. Auto insurance has become more expensive. And what is Donald Trump doing about all this? He's making the problem worse by threatening trade wars with our own allies. Here's what the CEO of Ford Motor Company said yesterday. The CEO of Ford Motor Company warned yesterday that, quote, a 25% tariff across the Mexico and Canadian borders will blow a hole in the U.S. industry that we have never seen. That's the head of Ford Motor, some liberal Democratic economist. The head of Ford Motor says that the tariffs will blow a huge hole, in the U.S. auto industry. What he's doing on tariffs is, again, sort of like everything else. It's sort of a meat axe approach, a slash and burn approach, not looking at each individual case and seeing what's good and what's bad. Inflation is the #1 issue on people's minds, the biggest issue during the election, and already Donald Trump is breaking his promise to do something about it. And the American people are starting to take notice already, even though we're only on day 25 of Trump's term. A recent CBS poll showed that 66% of voters do not think Trump is focused enough on lowering prices. 66% of voters do not think Donald Trump is focused enough on lowering prices. And you know what? They're absolutely right. In the 3 weeks that Donald Trump has been president, he's been focused on pretty much everything but fighting inflation, which is the #1 thing people care about. We've seen this maneuver so many times before from Donald Trump. He knows that he has no real answers to fixing inflation. So what does he do? He distracts, he distorts, he says ridiculous, wild, strange things, hoping to distract the country from the fact he's not doing his job. It's why he talks about things like renaming the Gulf of Mexico. It's why he's talking about hotels in Gaza. It's why he's talking about annexing Canada. None of these things have anything to do with the thing that matters most, lowering the cost of living for average American families. And meanwhile, what are the Republicans doing here in Congress? What are my Senate Republican colleagues doing? Are they fighting inflation, maybe? No way. No way. Republicans are full steam ahead with cutting taxes for the ultra-rich, paid for on the backs of working and middle-class families. Just look at the gargoyle-like budget proposal that the House Republicans released yesterday. Republicans want to make billionaires wealthier by raising costs for working people. The Republican budget slashes nutrition programs that help 40 million Americans put food on the table. The Republican budget proposes massive cuts to Medicaid, threatening health care for tens of millions of people. It will make food, health care, energy, and housing more expensive, all to cut taxes for the ultra-rich, hurting the middle class, raising costs for the middle class to help the ultra-wealthy. The Republican budget plan can be described in one word: radical. Republicans should remember well what happened the last time they cut taxes for the ultra-wealthy. It backfired with the rest of America. If Republicans try to cut taxes for the ultra-rich again, history is going to repeat itself, and it will cost them dearly at the ballot box. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks. Mr. President,
The senator from Arkansas.
I ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that our intern on the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, Kylie Henneberry, be granted floor privileges through May 9th, 2025, and that CFTC detailee Kevin Webb also be granted floor privileges through the end of the 119th Congress.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm honored to speak on the floor of the Senate and support Brooke Rollins to be Secretary of Agriculture. The Senate will vote on her nomination to this cabinet position today, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes. America's farmers, ranchers, foresters need a leader at USDA who will be an advocate for their livelihoods in rural America and be a strong voice to address the pressing needs of our agricultural community. Brooke Rollins is that person. In her hearing before the Senate Agriculture Committee, she pledged to do everything within her ability to ensure that our farmers, ranchers, and rural communities thrive. And we know she will follow through on that because rural America helped shape her into what she is today. She's leading a life of service that began with membership in her small town Texas FFA chapter and continues to credit her FFA advisor for his support and mentorship in her agriculture career. She invited him to attend the nomination hearing before the Senate Agriculture Committee last month, along with the Texas State FFA officer team she served with in high school. Texas Governor Rick Perry knew Brooke Rollins had a heart for Texas farmers and invited her to join his policy team where she advocated for agriculture. She continues that passion today. Her executive leadership during the first Trump administration and her regular collaboration uniquely qualified to serve in this position and advocate for family farms. She understands the significant responsibility of this role during one of the most economically challenging times for agriculture producers. Hardworking farmers who grow our food are struggling to operate, let alone make a profit in this current economic climate. High inflation and steep input costs far outpacing depressed market prices have put many farm families on a course towards bankruptcy, with multi-generational operations fighting to continue their family legacy. In December, Congress approved natural disaster and emergency assistance to help producers obtain critical operating loans for this crop year. Ensuring delivery of this aid will be one of her first priorities as Secretary. I'm confident she will pursue policies to help rural American live up to its potential. While we first met during the first Trump administration, I've had the opportunity to get to know her better during her confirmation process, and she has demonstrated her enthusiasm for being a voice for small-town American and agriculture producers. I'm grateful she is willing to take on this big responsibility and willing to be part of the solution to help rural America at this time of unprecedented challenges. As chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, I've met with farmers, ranchers, and agricultural stakeholders from all over the country, and they have been sounding the alarm of the dire circumstances they face in producing a safe, affordable, and abundant supply of food. Farmers from my home committee last week about the difficult conversations they are forced to have right now about continuing their multi-generational farms and risking their family's future in the industry. Unfortunately, this is a conversation many more farm families across the country will have if we do not act quickly. Congress must deliver an updated 5-year farm bill that modernizes the safety net, maximize liabilities in order to minimize the liabilities farm families take on when they plant their crops. Food security is national security. Our country is blessed to have grocery stores stocked with food to put on our tables. This is the result of the hard work of our farmers and ranchers. These producers need the tools to be successful and continue to grow the food, fiber, and fuel our nation depends on. I know Brooke Rollins shares my commitment to enhancing the policies that help farm families and rural communities thrive. Given her executive leadership, she is well prepared to hit the ground running, and she walks through the doors of USDA as secretary and deliver the certainty and predictability our producers need. I look forward to working with her to strengthen rural America and the men, women, and families who call it home. I also want to thank everyone on both sides of the aisle in making it such that we could do this in such a expeditious way. It took a lot of cooperation. I think it just shows how important our farmers are to both Democrats and Republicans. It's one of the few areas that's not a partisan issue. It's all about helping the men and women that work so very hard to provide the food that we need. So.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, anybody who knows me well knows that I say this a lot, and that is that agriculture is the lifeblood of South Dakota and the lifeblood of our country. And farmers and ranchers are hard at work every single day to feed America and the world. But what I hear lately from farmers and ranchers is not good. Agricultural producers across the country have faced strong headwinds in recent years. Higher input costs, high interest rates, lower commodity prices, all leading to declining farm income year after year. Natural disasters have struck many of our farm regions, and the bird flu continues to ravage agriculture across the country. Of course, the last few years, the Biden administration was hardly much help. It imposed burdensome regulations like WOTUS, or Waters of the United States, that threatened to devastate the farm sector. The administration put expanding market access on the back burner while our agricultural trade deficit grew to record levels. And their profligate spending led to inflation that hit farmers and ranchers especially hard in the form of higher input costs. Meanwhile, Democrats here in Congress failed to prioritize a modernized farm bill to support agriculture through these challenges. And we are now more than a year past due for an updated farm bill. Mr. President, American farmers and ranchers deserve better. much better. And I expect things will be different under President Trump. I know that farmers and ranchers will have a friend in Brooke Rollins, the President's choice for Secretary of Agriculture. Mrs. Rollins grew up in the small agricultural town of Glen Rose, Texas. She spent summers working for her family on their farm in Minnesota, helping with their corn, potato, and soybean crops. She was a 4-H'er, an FA state officer, and a barrel racer. And her 4 kids are keeping up the family's way of life, showing cattle in Texas. After studying agriculture development at Texas A&M, Mrs. Rollins went to work for then Governor Rick Perry, where she worked on agricultural policy. She then continued her ag work by building up a Texas think tank, empowering the voices of farmers, ranchers, and rural communities. Then she served in President Trump's first administration, leading the Office of American Innovation, and then the Domestic Policy Council. This President, Brooke Rollins, is a policy wonk with a farmer's heart. She understands the needs of agriculture producers, and she knows how to deliver results. And she promises to get right to work after she is confirmed on 4 key priorities. First, getting disaster and economic aid out the door and into the hands of farmers. Second, getting the bird flu and other animal disease outbreaks under control. Third, getting the Farm Bill done. And finally, revitalizing the U.S. Department of Agriculture to focus on its core mission and put America and American agriculture first. Mr. President, I'm looking forward to working with Mrs. Rollins on these key priorities. Under this Republican majority, delivering a modernized Farm Bill is a priority. And I'm glad Rollins has pledged to work with Congress on one of the top Farm Bill needs, which is strengthening the farm safety net, which is essential to keeping existing operations going and encouraging the next generation of producers to get started. I was also pleased to hear Mrs. Rollins acknowledge the need to improve management of national forests. The Black Hills National Forest, among others across the country, has seen its timber industry decimated by bad management policies. So I look forward to working with USDA under Secretary Rollins to provide relief from the dire situation in western South Dakota. And I'm encouraged as well that she will prioritize getting disaster and economic assistance out the door. Last year, many parts of the country suffered from natural disasters, including South Dakota. And as I said, farmers and ranchers have suffered lower commodity prices and declining incomes. In December, Congress passed $31 billion in agricultural disaster and economic assistance. And we need to get that money into the hands of farmers and ranchers working to rebuild. Mr. President, Brooke Rollins understands the mission of USDA. She understands the day-to-day needs of America's farmers, and she has the expertise to deliver results. I trust that she will put America's farmers and ranchers first as Secretary of Agriculture, and I look forward to working with her in this role. Mr. President, later today I will introduce a bill to repeal the death tax. As I mentioned, as a resident of a rural state filled with family farms and ranches, I have made death tax repeal a priority for a long time. And I was proud to help secure a doubling of the death tax exemption in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This doubled exemption has provided certainty to a lot of farms and ranches and small businesses over the past 7 years. But the expanded exemption is expiring at the end of this year. And it's my hope that we will not merely extend this exemption, but that we will get rid of this fundamentally flawed tax once and for all. Mr. President, the death tax is fundamentally flawed both in theory and in practice. There should be a limit to how many times the government can tax you. The money you leave at your death has already been taxed by the government at least once, which makes the death tax double taxation. The government isn't even profiting all that much from this double taxation. That's right, the death tax accounts for a teeny tiny fraction of government revenue. In fact, there's reason to believe that the government would collect more in taxes if it got rid of the death tax entirely, due to the economic growth and job creation that would stem from its elimination. So how is there any support left for this burdensome tax? Well, Mr. President, that's a good question. For some, of course, heavy taxation is axiomatic. Do well, their thinking runs, and the government should come after you. Some think that you shouldn't be able to pass the results of hard work down to your children upon your death. Well, Mr. President, death tax proponents tend to talk as if the death tax only affects the extremely wealthy. But nothing, of course, could be further from the truth. The death tax can sweep up those who have very little in the bank, notably family farms and ranches and family businesses. How? Well, farming and ranching is often a cash-poor business. A farmer might have substantial-looking assets on paper, but the vast majority of that is land and farming equipment. Only a small fraction of it is in the bank. On top of that, farmland can often be valued at a level that is inconsistent with its agricultural productivity value. A farmer might have land with a substantial value on paper, but the crop yield on that land could be worth far, far less. So what happens when a farmer or rancher dies and his estate is subject to the tax? There's a very good chance that his liquid assets, in other words, the cash that he has available in the bank, won't come close to covering the tax bill from the federal government. And the only alternative for his heirs may be to start selling off land or farm equipment to pay the tax. In some cases, they will be able to keep the farm, just a smaller version of it. In others, they may have to sell off the family farm entirely. The case is similar with family-owned businesses. The owner might appear to have substantial-looking assets on paper, but only a small fraction of that may be money in the bank. The vast majority may be tied up in the business. And once again, when the federal government comes around demanding a huge portion of this individual's taxable estate, there may not be anywhere close to enough money in the bank to pay the tax. To pay the federal government, the owner's descendants will have to sell off part or all of the family business. Now, Mr. President, family farms and ranches are the lifeblood of rural communities in South Dakota. They're a source of jobs. They provide support for local businesses. They help build up local schools and local infrastructure. Losing a local farm can hit rural communities very, very hard, especially when that farm or ranch is bought up by an out-of-state business with few ties to the community and limited interest in building it up. And, Mr. President, it's not just those who actually get hit by the estate tax who suffer. A lot of family farms and ranches and family businesses spend a lot of time and money on estate planning to avoid being hit by this tax. That's time and money that could have gone into building their business, investing in new equipment, hiring new workers, and the list goes on. Some set aside capital to prepare for the death tax, capital that, again, could go into building up the farm or ranch or hiring new workers for the family business. As one of my Democrat colleagues, the senior senator from Washington, said a while back, and I quote, "The estate tax is bad for businesses, it is bad for workers and new job creation, and it is bad for our communities who are watching their local family-owned businesses get swallowed up by large corporations," end quote. Well, Mr. President, as I said, we protected a lot more family farms and family businesses by doubling the death tax exemption in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017. But we didn't protect them all. And those we did protect will lose those protections at the end of this year. It is time to end this punishing and burdensome tax once and for all. I want to thank my Republican colleagues who have joined me in sponsoring this legislation. And, Mr. President, I hope that 2025 will be the year that we permanently bid farewell to the death tax. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alston-Brooks.
Ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for up to 15 minutes, Senator Crapo for up to 5 minutes, and Senator Schumer for 2 minutes prior to the scheduled votes.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, late into the night, senators spoke on the Senate floor about why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the least qualified nominee to ever be tapped as America's chief health officer. On issue after issue, Mr. Kennedy has demonstrated a profound lack of knowledge at best and deeply dangerous views at worst. Mr. Kennedy has refused to tell how he would manage health care issues that they're deeply worried about: vaccine safety, drug pricing, and affordable health care, to name a few. This leaves, Mr. President, millions of Americans alarmed about the future of health and science in America. Last week, 2 Oregon medical students approached me to talk about Mr. Kennedy's nomination. These medical students told me they were less concerned about the damage Mr. Kennedy would do as HHS Secretary in the weeks and months to come. These medical students are not only worried about the prospect of losing cures, treatments, and medical breakthroughs if Mr. Kennedy is confirmed. These medical students from Oregon told me that his unwillingness to take science and medical data seriously is going to harm science for decades to come. So I ask my colleagues to think about those medical students' words. Is that a legacy you want to leave behind as a result of supporting Mr. Kennedy? Senate Democrats have been making this exact case. In his hearing before the Finance Committee, I asked Mr. Kennedy to square his anti-vaccine views with more recent statements designed to appease a number of our senators who are quite nervous about his nomination. In his testimony, he used the fact that his own children were vaccinated to prove he was not anti-vaccine. But the record shows that just a few years ago, he said he would, quote, do anything and pay anything to go back in time in order to prevent them from getting those vaccines. Elsewhere in his testimony, Mr. Kennedy stated he was not anti-vaccine, but rather pro-safety. But about 18 months ago, he said on a podcast, and I quote, no vaccine is safe and effective. In other words, Mr. President, in the Senate Finance Committee, we brought the evidence, we brought the receipts, and Mr. Kennedy said nothing to actually disavow his prior statements. He stuck by the time-worn tactics of a conspiracy theorist. Always ask for more evidence and never accept the evidence that's placed in front of you. Even some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are now deeply disturbed by Mr. Kennedy's refusal to entertain evidence that would require him to change his mind on vaccine safety. Nevertheless, it sure looks like my Republican colleagues have bowed to pressure from Donald Trump and are poised to hand Mr. Kennedy the platform he has been seeking for 2 decades to push fringe views. So before the Senate votes, I'd like to take a moment to talk a little bit about the fights ahead on health care. Republicans in the House are already pressing ahead this morning with their plan to kick millions of Americans off of their health insurance in order to fund more tax cuts for those who are very wealthy. And as HHS Secretary, Mr. Kennedy is going to be a key player in this effort. While senators were on the floor speaking yesterday, the Senate Budget Committee debated a budget resolution that unlocks the legislative tools Republicans need to make good on their go-it-alone plan. At the same time, the House Budget Committee released its own budget resolution that will be debated today. Mr. President, what is clear in both of these blueprints, in their game plan, is that Medicaid cuts are at the top of the list. 81 million Americans rely on health care coverage under Medicaid, and the CHIP program for kids. Those people are folks with disabilities, low-income families, seniors, and of course children. The damage and destruction to American families if Republicans go through with their plans to gut Medicaid cannot be overstated. Take nursing homes, for example. 2 out of 3 nursing home residents are currently being covered for their health care by Medicaid. Imagine you visit your mom in her nursing home in the months after the Republican bill makes steep cuts to Medicaid. Your mom complains there are fewer and fewer staff. She had to wait more than an hour after calling for help to use the bathroom on several occasions. Next time you visit, she tells you some of the new staff don't have time for her. You learn that the facility no longer has the resources to conduct background checks. The manager pulls you aside to deliver some bad news. Her nursing home can no longer accept patients with Medicaid after steep federal cuts to the program. Unless you can find another facility that accepts Medicaid, you've got to pay the high monthly cost out of your own pocket. Suddenly, and with no warning, you've got impossible options. Either you scramble to find the money to cover a new facility that costs thousands of dollars a month, or you bring your mom home with you. So between holding down a full-time job and raising young kids, suddenly you have to deal with making sure that your mom gets full-time care, and that requires nursing assistance around the clock. Unfortunately, this case I described is something you see in every nook and cranny of America. I know that from my days as co-director of the Gray Panthers. And I know that many of your friends and neighbors with aging parents and grandparents in nursing homes are facing the catastrophe that I've just described. Now, Republicans are going to do somersaults to disguise their cuts to Medicaid, and they're going to describe it in health care lingo that they think plays well with people. For Republicans, every single child, senior, or family struggling to pay the bills that gets denied coverage is a win. And that brings us to Mr. Kennedy. During his confirmation hearing on everything from abortion to vaccines to Medicare and Medicaid, Mr. Kennedy was given ample opportunity to go on the record about how he would improve these programs, bring down costs, save taxpayers money, and improve care. Instead, he showed a complete lack of understanding of the basics of Medicaid and how it functions. I personally believe it shouldn't be too much to ask for the future CEO of Medicaid to understand how important it is to provide affordable coverage for millions of families. Republicans, with Donald Trump at the helm, are steering our country toward a health care cliff. Their ultimate objective is to take away Medicaid from as many people as they can. Colleagues, so much for making America healthy again. What the American people need is a leader who will be the voice of reason in the room as Trump and his assistants in Congress start slicing and cutting. Our country needs a leader at Health and Human Services who's actually going to work to improve care and lower costs, defend the reproductive freedoms of families, and listen in particular to facts and science. The American people have no reason to believe, based on the record, the evidence that the Senate Finance Committee has accumulated, to believe Mr. Kennedy will be that leader. There is no question the health care system in America needs reforms. It's falling short, and Democrats want to work in a bipartisan way on those issues. We are disillusioned by a system that puts profits over patients in too many circumstances. Nobody on this side of the aisle is arguing for the status quo. But the solution, colleagues, and I'm closing with this, does not lie in Donald Trump's, quote, concept of a plan to make our country less healthy, less safe, and less successful. When kids are kicked off their Medicaid coverage and forced to go without basic medical care and grow up with chronic illnesses that leave them in a lifetime of pain and suffering, Republicans are going to regret any vote they give to Robert Kennedy. When seniors are told they have to vacate their nursing homes because it no longer accepts Medicaid, Republicans again will regret a vote for Robert Kennedy. When families are struggling to pay the bills and they're landed with a mountain of medical debt because their kid got sick and they were kicked off their insurance, finally Republicans will regret any decision they give, any vote they give to Robert Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy will no doubt be right alongside Republicans, a willing participant in the future for health care that I've described today that is really stepping back from progress that has been made. I urge a no vote, colleagues, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Senator from Idaho. Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in support of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination to be Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and to urge my colleagues to vote in favor of his confirmation. Contrary to the attacks that have constantly been made on him, he has made it very clear that he will support safe vaccinations and just wants to see that the research on them is done and done well. When his nomination for the role of Secretary of HHS was announced, Mr. Kennedy stated, "We have a generational opportunity to bring together the greatest minds in science, medicine, industry, and government to put an end to the chronic disease epidemic facing Americans." I agree with him. We've got to get into the business of making America healthy again. Mr. Kennedy's dedication to this commitment has been bring a fresh perspective to health care, prioritizing consumer choice, information transparency, and early interventions to strengthen the well-being of all Americans. He has been responsive to a wide variety of questions from members on both sides of the aisle, appearing before 2 committees and answering hundreds of questions for the record, not to mention going through the extensive vetting process of the Finance Committee, which I chair, which is the most extensive vetting process that any candidate in the Senate goes through, for a position in this administration goes through in the Senate. While some of my colleagues continue to question his financial agreements, Mr. Kennedy met and then exceeded the requirements set forth by the Office of Government Ethics. Mr. Kennedy has participated in one of the most extensive processes, as I've said, that our Senate puts a nominee through, and has succeeded in meeting those standards. And I encourage my colleagues to support his nomination. Now, before I close, I want to respond briefly to the comments that we've heard today here on the floor and all day yesterday in a long Budget Committee hearing to set up the first reconciliation legislation to come before the Congress. It was said today, Republicans are going to take Medicaid away from children. They are going to take health care away from seniors. It was said yesterday that we were going to go after pretty much old people, young people, middle-aged people, and every other kind of people, because we are going to destroy the support base that they have here in the federal system. The fact is, this is the politics of fear, the politics of claiming things that are going to happen which are not going to happen. The reality is that yesterday's Budget Committee meeting was not on health care. There was nothing done in the meeting yesterday that would have done any of the things that you've heard on the floor today. What we did do yesterday was to set up a process so we can provide some significant extra spending authority to our government to close the border and deport the violent criminals who have come into our country in the millions in the last few years. We had another provision in it to give significant new resources to our national defense so that we can build back our Department of Defense and the authority of those in our armed services, the ability of those of our armed services members to have the technology and the equipment and be capable of responding to threats to our nation. And finally, we restarted and charged up our use and using America's energy in America so that we can get back into the business of being independent and not relying on other nations for our energy policy. Those are the three things that we focused on in the committee yesterday. And by the way, each one of those was a little bit costly, and every one of those was offset so that there was no increase in federal spending. Mr. President, I think we need to argue over facts when we get into these debates. We're going to have a tremendous number of debates. And yes, we will debate on health care at some point. But yesterday, and what we did yesterday, was focused on the border, on national defense, and on reboosting our energy production in America. I encourage a strong yes vote for Robert F. Kennedy to be the next Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
I would ask unanimous consent for 1 minute for an opportunity to respond to my colleague from Idaho.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would only say to my friend from Idaho that he says this is not going to happen, that people are going to be safe and seniors on Medicaid and the like will be safe. I would just say to my colleague, it starts today in the other body of Congress. I'd say to my colleague, the process of setting in motion these cuts to essential health care services begins today. We can read about it in the publications about the congressional schedule. I look forward to working with my colleague when we can. But on this point that it's not going to happen, everybody's going to be safe, the efforts to cut these vital programs, including Medicaid, begins this morning in the other body, and I yield the floor.
Could I have 30 seconds to just respond? I ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would simply say that we hear this every time we look at trying to address the spending excesses in our government. And I will just say to my colleague and everyone, we're not going to take health care away from children. We're not going to take health care away from adults, from seniors, or middle-aged people. We are not going to attack the benefits that people get under Medicare. And frankly, we will reform some of the spending, yes, but we will not do all of the terrible things that are being spun up to try to attack this effort to control the excessive spending in our government.
Democrat leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the fact that we're here right now, that we're even here right now, voting on this wildly unqualified conspiracy theorist to trust with one of the most life or death jobs, HHS Secretary, charged with protecting the health of every single American, should be an affront to every senator and the millions of Americans that will be impacted by this horrific nomination. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I implore you, think one last time about this vote. My colleagues on the Republican side, you know the consequences of what you're doing. My colleagues on the Republican side, you know how dangerous this is. My colleagues on the other side, you know you are not putting your constituents, their health, their families first when you vote yes. To quote my colleague, the junior senator from Texas, just a few years ago, he said, quote, "We need an expert. We need a scientist. We need someone who knows something about health care heading the Health and Human Services Department." Well, which is Robert Kennedy? An expert? A scientist? Or what about the senior senator from Louisiana, the chair of the Health Committee, and a well-respected medical professional himself? A few years ago, here's what he said. Previous HHS secretaries have had a pharmaceutical industry background, have been a state health commissioner, have run health systems have been governors, somebody who has had a background in actually administering the programs that HHS administers. I ask my colleagues, which of these qualifications does RFK possess? You know the answer, none of them. The question in front of this body today, the question in front of this body is not simply to confirm RFK to run the nation's health department. The question before us is very simple. Which is more important to you? The health and well-being of your constituents, or blindly obeying orders, knowing full well the dangerous impacts your vote will enable? I plead with you one more time, rethink this issue. This is wrong, very wrong. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is expired. The question occurs on the Kennedy nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, thank you, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bozeman, Cornyn, Crapo, Graham, Mullen, Risch, Rounds, and Tuberville. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Gallego, Lujan, Markey, Schumer, and Wyden. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Justice, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Also Brooks, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. McCormick, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Ms. Collins, aye. I did, thank you. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Schatz? No. Ms. Smith? No. Mr. Husted, aye. Ms. Lemus? Aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Kim, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Fisher, aye. Ms. Slotkin? No. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Welch? No. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Paul, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The confirmation is confirmed. Just number 4? Yeah, but just number 4. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Under the previous order, the cloture motion with respect to the Rollins nomination is withdrawn. The clerk will report the Rollins nomination.
Department of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins of Texas to be Secretary.
The question occurs on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters,
Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Capito, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Fisher, Gallego, Hickenlooper, Hyde-Smith, Justice, Kennedy, Klobuchar, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Paul, Rosen, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Sheehy, Slotkin, Welch. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Blumenthal, Herrero, Kim, King, Lujan, Padilla, Smith, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Fetterman, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Reed. Reed, no. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. McCormick. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Markley, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mrs. Brett, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Miss Ernst, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Schumer, no.
The yeas are 72, the nays are 28, and the nomination of Brooke Rollins is confirmed. So, just this one. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Howard Lutnick of New York to be Secretary.